Picture this. You're 18 years old, dressed in a torn white peasant shirt that smells of someone else's sweat, your wrists bound with rough hemp rope. You are sitting backwards on a starving mule, its ribs visible through patchy fur, and the animal stumbles every few steps because no one has fed it in 2 days. The streets of Istanbul stretch around you, the same streets where 4 years ago thousands of citizens threw rose petals at your golden carriage and screamed prayers for your long reign. Today they are throwing mud. Today they are throwing stones. A baker who once kissed the hem of your caftan steps out of the crowd and spits directly into your face. We usually imagine Ottoman sultans on jeweled thrones, surrounded by silk-clad viziers and hundreds of bowing servants, commanding armies that stretched from Algiers to Baghdad, not paraded through the hippodrome like a thief caught stealing bread. But right now, Sultan Osman II, the 17th ruler of the House of Osman, the commander of the faithful, the shadow of God on earth, is being dragged toward the dungeons of Yedikule Fortress, where in a few hours a man named Sebasai Dervish Aga will loop a red silk bowstring around his neck and pull. The chronicler Mustafa Naima, writing decades later from the Ottoman state archives, recorded that before sunrise his ear would be cut from his head and delivered to his own stepmother in a velvet pouch as proof of death. This was the first time in 3 centuries of Ottoman history that a sitting sultan had been murdered by his own soldiers. The men who killed him were not foreign invaders or rival princes. They were his personal bodyguards, the elite slave warriors whose salaries he paid from his own treasury. How does a teenage sultan who commanded over 100,000 men and ruled 3 continents end up strangled in a dungeon by the bodyguards sworn to die for him? Before we walk into the bloodiest 24 hours in Ottoman history, if you find these forgotten political collapses as fascinating as I do, take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. And please drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from. I genuinely love seeing how this kind of story reaches people from Cairo to Lahore to Manchester, all of us connected across centuries by a shared curiosity about how power actually works. To understand why Osman II ended up on that mule, you have to understand the bizarre institution that shaped him, the caliphs, the cage. By the early 17th century, the Ottoman dynasty had abandoned its older custom of fratricide, where a new sultan would execute all his brothers on coronation day to prevent civil war. The new system seemed gentler on paper. Royal princes were no longer killed. They were simply locked away. The caliphs was a windowless suite of rooms deep inside Topkapi Palace, where male heirs to the throne were kept under armed guard for years, sometimes decades. They were given concubines who had been sterilized, eunuch tutors, and a small library. They never met a foreign ambassador. They never saw a battlefield. They never managed a budget or commanded a soldier. Many of them lost their minds inside those walls, developing what modern psychologists would recognize as severe institutional trauma, paranoid hallucinations, and a complete inability to function in daylight. Osman's uncle Mustafa was one such prisoner. By 1617, when his father died, Mustafa had been in the cage for 14 years and could barely complete a sentence. Court records describe him laughing at nothing, throwing gold coins into ponds for the fish, and tearing the turbans off his own viziers in fits of confusion. The viziers tried to make him rule anyway, but within 3 months they realized the empire was sliding toward collapse under a man who could not remember his own name. So they reached deeper into the palace and pulled out a 14-year-old. Osman had been raised under slightly different circumstances. His mother, a Greek concubine named Mafaraz, had insisted on real tutors, real books, real instruction. The boy spoke Arabic, Persian, Greek, and Latin. He had read Niccolò Machiavelli's writings in translation. He understood de Balentri bookkeeping. According to the chronicler Ibrahim Pesevi, the boy could recite passages from Ibn Khaldun on the rise and fall of dynasties at age 12. He was, by every contemporary account, the sharpest royal mind the Ottoman dynasty had produced in a generation. Now imagine waking up one morning at 14 years old in a quiet apartment where you have spent your entire life, and being told that you have been pulled from school. You are now responsible for managing the Pentagon, the Federal Reserve, the Vatican, and the foreign policy of 3 continents, all before lunch. You have never negotiated with another adult outside your tutors. You have never disciplined a subordinate. You have never been disobeyed. And every man kneeling before you in the throne room is older than your father would have been, has commanded armies, has murdered rivals, and is calculating how to manipulate you. That is the throne Osman II inherited. The viziers expected another puppet, a child they could mold and milk for 2 decades. They had badly misjudged the boy in front of them. Osman's first crisis arrived in the spring of 1621, when he was 17. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had been raiding Ottoman vassal territory in Moldavia, and the young Sultan decided to do something no Ottoman ruler had done in over 40 years. He would personally lead the army into battle. His viziers begged him to stay in Istanbul. Sultans, they explained, did not need to ride to war anymore. They sat in the capital, accepted reports, and let the generals handle the killing. Osman refused. He believed, with the dangerous clarity of a teenager who had read too many history books, that the empire had grown soft precisely because its rulers had stopped sharing the dirt and blood of their soldiers. He intended to fix that personally. The campaign moved north through Bulgaria and Moldavia toward a fortress town called Kotnin, on the banks of the Dniester River. Osman rode at the front of an army that contemporary Polish sources estimated at over 100,000 men, including approximately 40,000 janissaries, the elite infantry corps that had been the spine of Ottoman military power for 2 centuries. What happened at Kotnin broke something inside the young Sultan that never healed. The janissaries refused to charge. When ordered into the breach beneath the fortress walls, entire regiments simply sat down and demanded bonus pay. When ordered to dig siege trenches, they looted their own supply wagons instead and sold the stolen flour to Polish merchants across the river. Polish hussars, the famous winged cavalry of the Commonwealth, rode out from behind the walls and cut Ottoman lines apart while janissary commanders haggled over coffee allowances. After 6 weeks of humiliation, with winter closing in and the army melting away from desertion, Osman was forced to accept a peace treaty that returned almost nothing of what he had marched out to conquer. He rode back to Istanbul in a black mood that his court attendants would never forget. The Venetian ambassador's dispatches, preserved in the archives of the Republic, described the young Sultan as having returned, transformed, like a man who has seen the rot beneath the gold. Every previous Sultan in this situation would have done one thing. He would have paid the janissaries a massive accession bonus, increased their coffee rations, kissed their commanders on both cheeks, and pretended the humiliation had never happened. That was the unwritten contract that had kept the janissaries loyal for 2.5 centuries. The Sultan owns the empire. The janissaries own the Sultan. Osman did the opposite. He publicly named the cowardly commanders. He cut the coffee rations. He canceled the traditional accession bonus retroactively. And then, in the privacy of his chambers, he began drafting a plan to dismantle the entire janissary corps and replace it with a new army loyal only to him. I always find this moment genuinely chilling to read about, because the 17-year-old who picked up that pen had effectively just signed his own death warrant. He could not have known it, but every decision he wrote down over the next 10 months was a line in his own funeral inscription. The plan Osman developed over the winter of 1621 and the spring of 1622 was, in pure administrative terms, a masterpiece. The chroniclers Mustafa Naima and Ibrahim Pesevi, working from documents that have since vanished from the imperial archives, have left us fragments detailed enough to reconstruct its outline. The janissary corps was recruited through a system called the devshirm, the blood tax. by which Christian boys from the Balkans were taken from their families, converted to Islam, and trained from childhood into the Sultan's slave army. By Osman's reign, the corps had become hereditary, corrupt, and politically untouchable. The original Janissary was a child soldier with no family, no property, and no loyalty except to the Sultan. The Janissary of 1622 was a married man who ran a shop in the bazaar, paid bribes to keep his name on the muster roll, and considered his real career to be civilian. Osman's solution was mathematically elegant. He would not attack the Janissaries directly. He would bypass them. He would raise a new army from three sources the corps could not control: Turkish peasants from the Anatolian heartland, Arab tribesmen from Syria, and Mamluk cavalry from Egypt. These men would have no ethnic, religious, or institutional ties to the Janissaries. They would be paid directly from the Sultan's privy purse rather than the corps treasury. They would be commanded by officers Osman selected personally, drawn from the provincial gentry of Anatolia rather than the Devshirme aristocracy of the capital. Within 5 years, by his calculation, the new army would outnumber the Janissaries. Within 10 years, the Janissaries would be reduced to a ceremonial palace guard. Within 15 years, the corps would be quietly dissolved through attrition. The empire would have its first genuinely loyal army since the conquest of Constantinople nearly 2 centuries earlier. The enforcement mechanism was equally clever. Any Janissary officer who resisted the reform was not punished. He was promoted, then transferred to a remote frontier post on the Persian border or the Upper Nile, where the salary still arrived but in depreciated copper currency rather than silver, and where local pashas had been quietly instructed to find administrative excuses to delay his pay. Think of this as a corporate CEO planning to replace his entire engineering department without firing anyone. He quietly opens a second office in another city. He hires a parallel team. He routes new projects exclusively to the new team. The original engineers still draw their salaries but stop receiving meaningful work. Over 5 years, they either retire, transfer, or quit. By the time they realize what has happened, the new team has fully replaced them. No lawsuit, no public conflict, no board intervention. It was, by any measure, brilliant institutional surgery. The problem was that the patient had been reading the surgeon's mail. Osman knew he could not simply announce the plan. The moment the Janissaries understood what was being prepared, they would storm the palace and depose him before the first new recruit was sworn in. He needed a cover story large enough to mask the entire operation. He needed an excuse that no Janissary commander could question without committing public blasphemy. He found one in the Hajj. In the spring of 1622, Osman announced to his court that he intended to perform the pilgrimage to Mecca in person. This was unprecedented. No reigning Ottoman sultan had ever made the journey. Sultans were considered too vital to the empire's stability to risk on the long desert road. The announcement landed in Istanbul like a religious earthquake. The young sultan, the scholars said, was modeling himself on the early Rashidun caliphs, returning to a purer form of Islamic kingship. The English ambassador Sir Thomas Roe, whose letters back to London remain one of the most valuable sources we have for this period, wrote that the preparations had an eerie precision to them. Roe noticed immediately that the Sultan was not simply assembling a pilgrimage caravan. He was systematically moving the treasury, the royal household, and key administrative officers out of Istanbul. Roe could not yet see the full picture, but he recorded in a dispatch to King James I that the boy intends something more than prayer. Here is what Roe was looking at. The pilgrimage route ran from Istanbul through Konya in central Anatolia, then south through Damascus to Medina and Mecca. Every city along that route was deep in territory where Osman's new army would be raised. By moving the treasury along the pilgrimage road, Osman would have funds in place to pay new recruits. By moving the royal household, he would have a functioning capital outside Istanbul if the Janissaries revolted. By moving his loyal administrators, he would have a parallel government ready to operate the moment the reform was announced. The audacity of it still takes my breath away when I sit with the documents. He was using the holiest journey in Islam as bureaucratic camouflage for a military coup against his own bodyguards. He was weaponizing the 5 pillars of his own religion, and he was doing it at 18 years old. The fatal flaw was not in the plan. The fatal flaw was that he had no idea how completely the Janissaries had infiltrated the palace around him. By 1622, the Janissary Corps was not simply an army. It had become a parallel state operating inside the Ottoman Empire, with its own economy, its own intelligence network, and its own clergy. Over 2 centuries, the Corps had quietly absorbed the major guilds of Istanbul. The bread bakers paid Janissary protection money. The leather tanners answered to Janissary masters. The city's fire brigade, theoretically a municipal service, was staffed and commanded by retired Janissaries who used emergency response as cover for surveillance. The coffee houses, which had become the central forum of urban political conversation, were licensed through Janissary intermediaries who knew which tables to listen at and which rumors to plant. Most dangerously, the Corps had developed a deep relationship with the Softa, the religious students of the great mosque schools. These young theologians depended on Janissary patronage for stipends, housing, and book purchases. In exchange, they provided the Corps with something a slave army could never generate on its own: religious legitimacy. The eyewitness chronicler Tugi Celebi, who lived through the events and wrote about them within months of their occurrence, recorded one detail that should have terrified Osman if he had known it. Every letter that left Topkapi Palace passed through the hands of scribes who had been bribed by Janissary agents. Every council decision was copied. Every order to a provincial governor was read by Janissary intelligence before it reached its destination. The young sultan was composing his reform program in a room where the walls were transparent. The network functioned in both directions. It extracted information from Osman. It also planted information against him. By April 1622, the coffee houses of Istanbul were buzzing with 3 rumors. First, that the young sultan had been driven mad by his humiliation at Cotton and was no longer competent to rule. Second, that he had secretly converted to Christianity under the influence of European tutors and intended to surrender the empire to the Pope. Third, and most dangerously, that the pilgrimage to Mecca was a fraud, that Osman intended to use the journey to abolish the Hajj entirely and impose a new heretical religion of his own design. None of these rumors had any factual basis. All of them were spreading through the city faster than the imperial post could carry messages to the provinces. By the time Osman noticed, the population of his own capital had been mentally prepared to accept his removal as a religious necessity. This is what regulatory capture looks like in its purest historical form. The institution that was supposed to serve the state had become more powerful than the state itself, and the moment the state tried to assert authority over it, the institution simply rewrote reality faster than the state could respond. On the morning of May 18, 1622, Osman gave the order for his personal kaftans, his prayer carpets, and the imperial standard to be loaded onto the pilgrimage caravan. By noon, the Janissary barracks at Et Maidani had emptied. What followed was not a riot. It was not a spontaneous mutiny. The chronicler Naima, who interviewed survivors decades later, recorded that every movement of the mob was coordinated with the kind of precision that takes weeks of rehearsal. Janissary regiments converged on the hippodrome in disciplined columns. Mosque students arrived simultaneously from 3 directions, carrying prepared banners. Bakery carts that should have been delivering bread were instead distributing bread free of charge to the gathering crowd, ensuring that no participant would need to leave for food during the long day ahead. The first target was the Sheikhul Islam Esed Effendi, the highest religious authority in the empire. A delegation of Janissary officers, accompanied by senior Softa scholars, arrived at his residence and demanded a fatwa declaring Sultan Osman II unfit to rule. Esed Effendi tried to refuse. He pointed out that no theological grounds existed for such a ruling. The young sultan had not violated Islamic law. He had not committed apostasy. He had not been declared insane. The delegation explained, with the polite menace that institutional power uses when it no longer needs to pretend, that the fatwa was not a request. By sundown, the document was written, signed, and being read aloud at the gates of Topkapi Palace. The second target was Mustafa I, the broken uncle, still locked in the cage where he had been returned after his short and disastrous first reign. Janissary officers smashed open the doors of the cafes, dragged the trembling man into daylight for the first time in 4 years, dressed him in the imperial robes he could no longer recognize, and proclaimed him sultan for a second time. According to Tugi Celebi, Mustafa spent the entire ceremony asking quietly when his mother would come to take him home. The third target was Osman's Grand Vizier, Dilaver Pasha, who had remained loyal and tried to negotiate with the rebel commanders. He walked out of the palace gates under a flag of parley, carrying the Sultan's offer of concessions. The mob lynched him in the courtyard. They dragged his body through the streets, and according to multiple eyewitness accounts, fed portions of it to the street dogs that lived around the palace walls, in full view of the windows from which Osman watched. Every step of this had been rehearsed. The fatwa had been pre-drafted. The cage had been pre-scouted. The crowd had been pre-fed. This was not the chaos of an angry mob. This was a corporate hostile takeover executed by men in uniform. Osman, watching his Grand Vizier's body being torn apart in the courtyard below his window, tried to adapt in real time. He had read history. He knew the playbook every previous sultan had used to break a Janissary revolt. He started with gold. He ordered his treasurers to bring chests of silver coins to the palace walls and throw them down into the crowd. This had worked for his great-grandfather Suleiman the Magnificent. It had worked for his father Ahmed I. It had worked for every Ottoman ruler back to Mehmed the Conqueror. A Janissary revolt, the chronicles taught, was always about money. Pay the bonus and the men go home. The coins fell into the crowd. The crowd kicked them aside without bending to pick them up. That was the moment, according to the surviving servants Naima later interviewed, when Osman understood what was actually happening to him. This was not a pay dispute. This was an execution. He tried tax exemptions. He had a herald announce that all bread taxes in Istanbul would be suspended for 1 year. The crowd booed and threw stones at the herald. He tried personal appearance. Against the advice of his terrified eunuchs, he walked out onto the second courtyard, in full ceremonial dress, with the prophet's mantle draped over his shoulders, and tried to address the mob directly. 3 previous sultans had successfully calmed Janissary revolts simply by appearing in person and reminding the men whose food they had been eating. Osman lifted his hands to speak. Someone in the crowd threw a horseshoe at his head. The eunuchs pulled him back inside before a second one connected. Finally, late that afternoon, the 18-year-old retreated to his mother Mafaraz's chambers in the harem, and according to a servant's testimony preserved in a private collection cited by Pesevi, recited the opening verses of Surah Yusuf and wept for almost an hour. Yusuf is the prophet who was betrayed by his own brothers and thrown into a well. The young sultan had chosen the verse with full understanding of its meaning. He sent a messenger to Kursum Sultan, the powerful stepmother who had effectively run the harem for a decade. Kursum was the mother of his half-brothers, including the future Sultan Murad IV, then a boy of 10. She had political influence the Janissary commanders respected. She could, in theory, broker a settlement. What Kursum did next has been debated by historians for 4 centuries. The most charitable interpretation is that she tried and failed to intervene. The most damning, supported by certain palace records, is that she calculated her own sons would be safer under a controlled Mustafa than under a reformist Osman, and quietly signaled to the rebel commanders that she would not oppose his removal. We will probably never know which is true. What we know is that no help came from her quarter. Picture this in modern terms. A young founder, 18 years old, has built a company. The board of directors has decided to remove him. He tries every tactic from his MBA playbook. He offers equity concessions. He offers compensation restructuring. He walks into the boardroom personally to make his case. None of it works, because the termination letter was signed 3 weeks ago, and every move he is making is one the board anticipated and prepared a counter for. He retreats to his office and calls his stepmother, who happens to sit on the board, hoping she will save him. She does not pick up the phone. By nightfall on May 19, 1622, Sultan Osman II had run out of options. The Janissaries did not simply want Osman deposed. They wanted him annihilated as a symbol. Naima describes what followed with a chronicler's cold attention to ritual detail. He was stripped of the imperial kaftan. The prophet's mantle was taken from his shoulders. He was dressed in a coarse white peasant shirt of the kind worn by Anatolian shepherds, the kind he had specifically refused to wear during the Cotton Campaign because he considered it beneath the dignity of the throne. They mounted him backwards on a worn-out mule from the palace stables, the kind of animal that pulled water carts and was scheduled for slaughter. They tied his hands at the wrists. The procession that left Topkapi Palace at dusk on May 19th moved slowly through the streets toward Yedikule, the Seven Towers fortress at the southwestern edge of the city, the place where Ottoman political prisoners had been executed for 2 centuries. Crowds lined the route. The same citizens who had thrown rose petals at his coronation now threw mud, stones, and rotten vegetables. A baker stepped forward and spat. A leather tanner reached up and tore a strip of cloth from the white shirt. No one in the crowd stopped them. No one in the procession stopped them either. The new Grand Vizier was David Pasha, whose appointment had been forced on the puppet Mustafa I by the Janissary leadership earlier that same day. David Pasha's wife was a senior Janissary patron with deep financial interests in the corps. David Pasha personally rode at the head of the procession, supervising every step. According to Naima, when the column reached Yedikule and Osman was dragged from the mule, David Pasha himself handed the bowstring to the executioner. The bowstring was red silk. This detail matters. For 2 centuries, the bowstring had been the traditional instrument used to execute Ottoman princes. It was considered a privilege of royal blood because it allowed execution without the spilling of that blood, which Islamic tradition treated as theologically problematic for members of the dynasty. Osman, throughout his reign, had hated this tradition. He had spoken openly about ending the practice of strangling royal brothers with bowstrings as a relic of an earlier and more barbaric age. The Janissaries gave him the red bowstring, the exact instrument he had wanted to abolish, the exact symbolism he had publicly rejected. They wrapped it around his neck inside the Yedikule dungeon, and Sebasai Dervish Aga, the chief executioner, pulled. He was 18 years old. Before sunrise on May 20th, 1622, an officer cut his right ear from his head, placed it in a small velvet pouch, and rode it across the city to deliver it to Kursum Sultan in the harem of Topkapi Palace, as required proof that the deed was complete. Kursum accepted the pouch in silence. What she felt looking at it, no chronicler ever recorded. I have read this passage in 3 different chroniclers over many years, and the spite of it still stops me cold. They did not just kill him. They killed the very idea that an Ottoman sultan could outrank his own soldiers. They used the instrument he wanted to abolish, in the prison he intended to reform, sanctioned by the religious authority he had tried to outmaneuver. Every element of his execution was a message. The message was that the corps owned the throne now, and any future sultan who forgot it would receive the same red silk in his bedchamber. We instinctively want to read this story as the moment the Ottoman Empire began its long death. That reading is too simple, and it misses the more disturbing truth. The empire did not collapse in 1622. It continued for another 3 centuries. Osman's death did not end the Ottoman state. It did something more insidious. It froze Ottoman reform for 200 years. Every sultan who came after Osman II read the chronicles of his last 24 hours. The story of the red bowstring became the central cautionary text of Ottoman political education. The lesson every prince absorbed from the caliphs was simple. Do not touch the Janissaries. Whatever else you reform, whatever else you modernize, whatever else you change, leave the core alone. They will kill you faster than your bodyguards can defend you, because your bodyguards are them. Sultan Murad IV, who came to the throne as a boy in 1623, only 1 year after his half-brother Osman's murder, grew into one of the most ruthless Ottoman rulers in history. He executed thousands of officials on suspicion of disloyalty. He banned coffee, tobacco, and wine in the capital on pain of death. He personally beheaded men in the streets at night. But he never seriously attacked the Janissary corps. He remembered the red bowstring. Sultan Selim III tried to do what Osman had planned. In the 1790s, working with French military advisors, he created a parallel European-style army called the Nizam Letter 131 Saidid, the New Order, designed to gradually replace the Janissaries. He used almost exactly the strategy Osman had drafted in 1622, raising the new force from Anatolian peasants and routing its funding outside the traditional military treasury. In 1808, the Janissaries deposed him. He was strangled in his prison cell a few weeks later. Only in 1826, more than 200 years after Osman's death, did a sultan finally succeed in destroying the core. Mahmud II spent 15 years preparing in absolute secrecy, learning every lesson from Osman's failure and Selim III's failure. When he finally moved, he did not announce reform. He provoked the Janissaries into an open revolt on his terms, sealed their barracks at Et Maidani with loyal artillery, and burned the buildings to the ground with the men inside. The death toll has been estimated at over 6,000 Janissaries killed in a single night. Ottoman historians named the event the Vaki-i-Hari, the auspicious incident. It took 2 centuries, 6 dead sultans, and an act of state terror that killed more soldiers than most of the empire's wars, to accomplish what an 18-year-old had tried to do quietly and bloodlessly in 1622. This is the historical pattern that should disturb modern readers. The institution that destroyed Osman II was not foreign. It was not even ideological. It was simply an entrenched bureaucracy that had become more powerful than the state that nominally owned it. When the young sultan tried to reform it, the bureaucracy proved that it could remove him faster than he could remove it. And that single demonstration of capacity rewired the entire empire's calculation of what was politically possible for the next 10 generations. You can see the same pattern in modern history every time a reformer is destroyed by the institution they tried to fix. Once a regulatory body, a military caste, an intelligence service, or an internal party apparatus successfully eliminates the first leader who threatens them, the institution becomes effectively untouchable for decades. Every subsequent leader looks at the example and concludes that reform is not worth the personal cost. The dysfunction calcifies. The state slowly hollows out around the protected institution. Eventually, the entire structure collapses, but the collapse takes a very long time, and the institution that caused it usually survives longer than the state it consumed. Osman II was buried quietly in the tomb of his father Ahmed I near the Blue Mosque 3 days after his death. There was no state funeral. There was no eulogy. The puppet Mustafa I, who could not have understood what was happening even if anyone had explained it to him, did not attend. The Janissary commanders did not attend. David Pasha, the Grand Vizier who had supervised the execution, did not attend. The mystery that has haunted Ottoman historians for 4 centuries is what happened to Osman's papers. The reform program he had been drafting throughout the winter of 1622 was, by all accounts, a substantial document. It included lists of officers to be dismissed, names of provincial governors to be promoted, instructions for the recruitment of the new Anatolian and Egyptian regiments, and a detailed budget showing how the privy purse would fund the parallel army during its first 3 years. None of these documents survive, not one page. The Ottoman state archives, which are otherwise remarkably complete for the early 17th century, contain a clean gap between May and August of 1622. Routine administrative correspondence vanishes. Treasury records are incomplete. Diplomatic dispatches are missing from the registry. The chronicler Nema, working 60 years later, noted the gap explicitly and could not explain it. Modern Turkish archivists working in the Başbakanlık Osmanlı Arşivi in Istanbul have studied this gap for over a century and have reached no consensus on who removed the documents or where they went. The most plausible reconstruction is that someone inside the palace, almost certainly working with the new Janissary leadership, systematically removed every document that named a co-conspirator of Osman's reform plan. The purpose was not to hide what Osman had tried to do. The Janissaries wanted that known, as a warning. The purpose was to hide who else inside the palace had supported him. The names of Osman's allies, the officers who would have stood with him if his pilgrimage had succeeded, were erased so that no future faction could rally around them. It is one of the cleanest acts of bureaucratic erasure in early modern history, accomplished without printing presses, without digital storage, without modern surveillance, simply by walking through the right rooms with the right authority and burning the right folders. 400 years of historians, with archival databases and infrared imaging and digital cross-referencing, still cannot reconstruct who was on Osman's side that night. The names are gone. The deliberate empty space in the archive is itself his most fitting monument. History is fundamentally uncomfortable. We want clean stories with clear heroes and villains, decisive battles and meaningful endings. Osman II offers none of that. He was a teenager who was probably right about everything. He saw the institutional cancer eating the empire he had inherited. He designed a serious, mathematically coherent plan to remove it. He executed the early stages of that plan with genuine political skill. And he was murdered by the cancer before he could finish. And the empire he tried to save spent the next 2 centuries dying slowly because no one else dared try. When you look at the modern world, at the institutional reformers who have been destroyed by the systems they tried to fix, at the regulatory bodies that have outlived every administration that tried to control them, at the military castes and intelligence agencies, and entrenched bureaucracies that have proven able to remove inconvenient leaders faster than those leaders could remove them, you are looking at the distant echoes of the red silk bowstring in the Yedikule dungeon. The Ottoman Empire did not die in 1622, but the possibility of saving it did. The boy in the torn white shirt, riding backwards on a starving mule through streets that had once thrown rose petals at his feet, was carrying the last serious chance the empire ever had. The mob that spat on him as he passed did not know they were spitting on their own future. They simply knew that a sultan had been told he could not touch their salaries, and he had not listened, and now he was being taught what listening meant. Thank you for joining me on this long walk through the darkest 24 hours in Ottoman history. If you found this breakdown of institutional collapse and political failure fascinating, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. And I genuinely want to hear what you think in the comments below. Was Sultan Osman II a foolish boy who moved too fast, who should have waited longer, built more allies, prepared more carefully? Or was he the last sultan who actually understood what was killing the empire, and the tragedy is simply that he was alone? What forgotten ruler or collapse should we put under the microscope in the next video? Drop your suggestions in the comments, and I will see you in the next one.